A gala night turns into a nightmare when a millionaire throws his baby to the lions. A heroic German shepherd saves the child, triggering an emotional journey of redemption and love. An animal trainer with a mysterious past is hired to investigate. Secrets surface, lives are transformed, and hearts are healed. Prepare for a story that will touch your soul. Subscribe, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. What drives a man to throw his own child to the lions? This question echoed in the minds of all the guests as the mother's scream tore through the starry night air. No one expected to witness the horror that unfolded in that luxurious mansion, where crystals tinkled and elegant laughter suddenly turned into screams of terror. Seconds stretched into hours. The small bundle, a life so fragile, so innocent, described an arc in the air, while the big cat's eyes gleamed in the gloom of the torchlit garden. It was as if time had decided to pause, freezing every held breath, every racing heartbeat. And then, like lightning cutting through the darkness, he emerged. A blur of golden fur and determined eyes. Powerful paws propelled his body into the air, intercepting the baby before the cruel fate could be sealed. Thor, the German shepherd, who until then had been resting unnoticed under a snack table, transformed into the unexpected hero of that fateful night. The silence that followed was deafening. The millionaire Edward Thompson remained motionless like a marble statue whose eyes reflected an inexplicable inner abyss. His wife, Caroline, slid to the floor in a silent faint, while Thor positioned himself protectively over the baby, who was now crying, safe and sound. It was in this scenario of contained chaos that Matthew Miller received a call 3 days later. The phone vibrated on his simple desk, in that apartment where the only luxury was the view of the small park where he trained his dogs. The voice on the other end sounded tense, controlled, like someone walking on an emotional minefield. "Mr. Miller, this is Robert, Edward Thompson's personal assistant. We urgently need your services." What Matthew didn't know, as he drove his worn car through the imposing gates of the Thompson mansion, was that this call would not only change his destiny, but also unearth secrets he had spent years trying to forget. The property gates opened with a metallic groan, as if reluctant to allow his entry. The private road snaked through impeccable gardens, where not a single leaf dared to be out of place. In the distance, the mansion rose like a monument to wealth and power. Windows reflected the afternoon sun. White marble gleamed with calculated coldness. However, it was impossible not to notice that something had changed. The curtains were all closed, like the tightly shut eyelids of a sleeping giant. The silence hung heavy in the air, interrupted only by the distant sound of barking, not the animated barks of a happy dog, but the nervous alerts of a vigilant guardian. Matthew parked his car, feeling out of place in that opulent setting. His hands, calloused from years of working with animals, contrasted with the aseptic perfection of the environment. Before he even touched the doorbell, the door opened, revealing a man in an impeccable suit and an impassive expression. "Mr. Miller, thank you for coming so quickly. I'm Robert. Please follow me. Mr. Thompson is waiting for you in the study." Sagre. Mansion corridors seemed endless, each step echoing on the marble floor. Priceless paintings adorned the walls, painted eyes following his movements like silent sentinels. Robert walked ahead, his rigid posture revealing more than words could express about the tension that hung in that house. "The incident was kept out of the media," Robert explained in a low voice as if the walls themselves could hear. "The Thompson family has enough influence to ensure certain stories don't spread. But the rumors—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Rumors were like water. They found their way through the smallest cracks. When they finally reached the study, Matthew was greeted by an imposing room. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves housed books that looked like they had never been touched. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling like a frozen constellation. And behind a fine wooden desk, Edward Thompson waited, his hands clasped together forming a bridge under his chin. "Mr. Miller," the voice sounded weaker than Matthew expected, from a man with such influence. "I appreciate your presence. I imagine you are already aware of the incident." Matthew nodded slightly. "Only what your assistant told me on the phone." An incident involving your son and your dog. An incident. The word hung in the air, inadequate, in its simplicity to describe the horror of that night. Thor isn't exactly my dog, Edward clarified, running a hand over his face as if trying to erase a memory. He belongs to the property, a guard dog who apparently decided to guard much more than we expected. His eyes, Matthew noticed, seemed clouded by something beyond fatigue. There was a subtle tremor in his hands that no wealth could disguise. I need to understand what happened with that animal, and I need to understand. Edward hesitated, his voice breaking. I need to understand what happened with me. It was then that the side door opened, and Caroline Thompson silently entered the room. Her pale face contrasted with her dark dress, her red eyes betraying sleepless nights. In her arms, cradled with an almost painfully protective tenderness, was little Michael, asleep and oblivious to the turmoil forming around him. And by her side, vigilant as a golden shadow, walked Thor. The German shepherd had eyes that Matthew recognized immediately, eyes of a born protector who had found his purpose. My husband says you're the best, Caroline spoke, her voice carrying as much ice as vulnerability. I sincerely hope he's right, because right now, this dog is the only thing that makes me feel my son is safe in this house. Thor kept his eyes fixed on Matthew, assessing him with an intelligence that transcended animal instinct. It was as if he could see beyond the carefully constructed layers the trainer had built over the years. What exactly do you expect me to do? Matthew asked, keeping his voice neutral, professional. I want to understand what happened, Edward replied. I want to know how a dog that barely interacted with the family suddenly turned into this. He gestured towards the animal that remained faithfully by Caroline's side. And I want to discover, he continued, lowering his tone, why I did what I did. The doctors talk about stress, a momentary breakdown. But I feel there's something deeper, something I can't access. Matthew observed the dynamic in the room. Caroline's sharp gaze, simultaneously protective and accusatory. Edward's defeated posture, a human empire in ruins. Thor, vigilant, connected by an invisible bond to the sleeping baby. And himself, a man whose past carried secrets that strangely echoed the situation before him. I'll need time, Matthew finally said. I'll need to observe Thor in different contexts, talk to everyone who witnessed the incident, and... He hesitated, knowing he was about to cross a line. I'll need to understand your family dynamic to comprehend how it affects the dog's behavior. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the soft sound of the baby's breathing. Mr. Miller will have full access to the property and staff, Edward declared, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. A room has been prepared for your stay. Robert will show you the facilities. When Caroline spoke again, her voice carried a strength that contradicted her fragile appearance. There is only one condition, Mr. Miller. Thor does not leave my son's side, no matter what your investigation requires. Matthew nodded, understanding that he was entering territory far more complex than he initially imagined. It wasn't just a case of animal behavior. It was a web of human emotions, traumas, and secrets that intertwined in ways he couldn't yet discern. We start tomorrow at dawn, he said, sealing an agreement that would forever change the destiny of everyone in that room. The following days at the Thompson mansion proved to be a study in contrasts. The opulence of the surroundings, Italian marble, priceless works of art, furniture that told stories of generations, contrasted with the emotional emptiness that echoed through the corridors. It was as if the house was a body without a soul, kept functioning only by the silent dedication of the staff who moved like ghosts. Matthew established a routine. In the morning, he observed Thor interacting with the baby. The gentleness with which that powerful animal positioned himself near the crib was almost poetic, an ancestral guardian fulfilling a sacred duty. Michael, with the innocence of his few months of life, seemed to find in the German shepherd's golden fur a comfort that transcended understanding. I've never seen anything like it, commented Rose, the middle-aged nanny who cared for Michael. It's like they talk without words. When the baby cries before any of us can even react, Thor is already alert. And there are days. She lowered her voice, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. There are days when the baby cries and only calms down when Thor is nearby, not even in his mother's arms. This last detail, Matthew noted, was something that weighed painfully on Caroline. He observed her from the shadows, seeing how her fingers trembled slightly as she tried to calm her son, how her eyes welled up when Michael only found peace feeling the dog's presence. "He stole my husband," she confessed one afternoon, as they watched. Thor and Michael in the garden, protected by a generous shade. "And now it seems he's stealing my son too." "It's not a competition, Mrs. Thompson," Matthew replied calmly. "Thor isn't replacing anyone. He's filling a void that wouldn't exist if my husband hadn't—" She couldn't finish, the words dying in her throat. Matthew knew he needed to be careful. What happened that night? Everyone present describes something that seems out of character for your husband. Caroline laughed, a bitter sound that seemed to scratch the air. "Character? Which one? The philanthropist who donates millions to children's causes? Or the man who threw our newborn son to a group of imported lions to impress guests?" Afternoons were dedicated to Edward, although accessing him became increasingly difficult. The man who controlled a business empire now barely managed to control his own thoughts. Matthew often found him in the study, staring fixedly at papers he wasn't really reading, or in the library, surrounded by books whose words no longer made sense. "I have flashes," Edward confessed during one of these sessions, his voice low, as if fearing that the words once spoken at normal volume would gain power over him. "Moments when I don't recognize myself. It's like something takes control, something dark, primitive." Matthew listened more than he spoke, observing the patterns, the hands that occasionally trembled, the momentary lapses in memory, the sweat that beaded on his forehead even in air-conditioned rooms. Nights, however, were when the true revelations happened. When the mansion slept and only a few staff remained alert, Matthew walked the corridors, following the trails of mysteries that accumulated. It was during one of these nocturnal walks that he found Anthony, the oldest employee of the house, an elderly man with white hair and eyes that carried the weight of many witnessed secrets. "It's not the first time," Anthony whispered, his wrinkled hands gripping Matthew's arm with surprising strength. His father was the same. Moments of darkness, as if something possessed them. Matthew felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "The Thompson family carries a shadow, Mr. Miller, a curse, some would say. For generations, there have always been stories. The grandfather who almost drowned his own daughter. The great-grandfather who set fire to his factory with employees inside, only to rebuild it bigger later. Moments of madness followed by periods of brilliance and generosity." "And Thor?" Matthew asked, sensing they were getting close to something important. "How does he fit into all this?" Anthony smiled, a sad smile laden with ancient knowledge. "The old ones said that every cursed family eventually finds its guardian, a protective spirit that comes to balance the forces. For generations, the Thompsons built wealth and power but lost something essential along the way. And you think Thor is that guardian?" "What I think," Anthony replied, "is that there are no coincidences. This dog appeared only 2 years ago. No one knows exactly from where. He was found at the property gates without a collar, without a chip. And since the first day, his eyes followed Mr. Edward as if waiting for something. As the weeks passed, the dynamic at the mansion subtly began to change. Curtains that were once closed now allowed sunlight in. Caroline, initially distant, began to seek Matthew's presence, asking questions that went beyond Thor's behavior. "How did you become an animal trainer?" she asked one morning, as they watched Michael crawling on the soft carpet, Thor vigilant a few steps away. Matthew hesitated. His past was a territory he rarely visited, much less shared. It was an unplanned path. "Few important paths are planned," she replied, her eyes revealing more understanding than Matthew was prepared to face. That night, alone in his room, Matthew relived memories he had buried years ago. The orphanage where he grew up, after the tragic accident that took his parents. The stray dog that appeared in the yard one day and became his only friend, his only family. How he had discovered, even as a child, that he could understand animals in a way others couldn't, not through words but through a deeper, more primordial connection. And then the fire, the flames that devoured the orphanage, the panic, the screaming children. How his dog had woken him up in the middle of the night, barking insistently until Matthew understood the danger. How together they had guided several children out of the burning building. And the guilt, the crushing guilt for not being able to save everyone. That same night, as if connected to Matthew's thoughts, Thor appeared at his door. The German shepherd simply sat in the hallway, staring intently at the trainer with those eyes that seemed to see through his soul. "You carry ghosts too, don't you?" Matthew whispered, extending his hand to touch the golden fur. Thor tilted his head, a gesture almost human in its comprehension. It was a moment of connection that transcended the professional, something Matthew knew he shouldn't allow, but that was inevitable. As if their souls recognized a shared pain, a common purpose. The next morning, a new element was added to the already complex equation. Reporters began to gather at the mansion gates, drawn by persistent rumors about the incident. Edward, visibly shaken, called an urgent meeting. "Someone talked," he declared, his eyes accusingly sweeping over each face in the room. Someone betrayed this family's trust. Caroline, who in recent days had begun to regain some of her former strength, faced her husband directly. "Maybe it's time for the truth, Edward. Maybe hiding what happened is destroying us more than any headline could." The tension between the couple was palpable, electrifying in its intensity. Matthew watched in silence, aware that he was witnessing a turning point. Thor, always sensitive to emotional shifts, positioned himself strategically between the couple and the crib where Michael slept, as if establishing an invisible boundary. "The truth?" Edward almost spat the word. "You want me to tell the world that I don't remember trying to kill our son? That I have moments when I don't control my own actions? That would destroy everything we've built, Caroline." "That," she retorted, tears glistening in her eyes. "That is exactly what I want you to admit. That you don't remember, that you weren't in control. Because the alternative is to believe that the man I loved for 10 years consciously tried to kill our baby." The silence that followed was deafening. "There's a third possibility," Matthew finally intervened, his calm voice contrasting with the emotion that charged the atmosphere. All eyes turned to him. "A medical condition, something neurological that explains these episodes." Edward stared at him, a spark of hope briefly shining in his exhausted eyes. "What do you know about that?" "I'm not a doctor," Matthew clarified, "but in my work with animals, I've seen erratic behavior caused by physical conditions. Dogs that suddenly attack their owners due to brain tumors. Cats that completely change personality due to chemical imbalances." A bitter laugh escaped Edward. "So now I'm compared to a sick animal?" "We are all animals," Matthew replied without hesitation. "We just forget it too often." It was the following week that the first major breakthrough happened. After Matthew and Caroline's insistence, Edward agreed to undergo a complete battery of neurological tests. The results arrived in a sealed envelope, delivered personally by a renowned doctor who had signed multiple confidentiality agreements. In the now familiar study, Dr. Smith opened his folder with deliberately slow movements. "Mr. Thompson, we found something significant in your tests." Edward, sitting rigidly in his chair, nodded almost imperceptibly. "There is a malformation in your temporal lobe. It's rare, known as atypical Kluver-Bucy syndrome. It can cause episodes of extreme, impulsive behavior, followed by periods of amnesia." Caroline brought a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "This condition," the doctor continued, "is hereditary in some cases, and highly treatable with the correct medication." The implications of that revelation exploded in the room like a silent grenade. It wasn't madness, it wasn't malice. It was a medical condition that had possibly affected generations of the Thompson family, explaining the episodes of darkness mentioned by Anthony. For Matthew, the pieces were starting to fit together. Thor hadn't simply saved Michael out of instinct. Something deeper was happening, as if the dog could sense the episodes even before they occurred, as if he had been sent precisely for this purpose. That night, as the full moon bathed the property in its silvery light, Matthew found Caroline in the garden, Thor faithfully by her side. Michael slept peacefully in the stroller near them, protected by a delicate mosquito net. "He started the treatment today," she informed him, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. "The doctors say it will take a few weeks to stabilize, but he should regain full control over time." Matthew nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "And you? How are you processing all this?" A sad smile touched her lips. "I'm navigating between relief and guilt. Relief to know I didn't marry a monster. Guilt for having doubted him, even for a moment. You had no way of knowing." "Maybe not," she agreed softly. "But Thor knew, didn't he? Somehow, he always knew." As if recognizing his name, Thor approached, resting his muzzle gently on Caroline's knee. His eyes, reflecting the moonlight, seemed to contain ancient wisdom. "What happens now?" Matthew asked, aware that his official work was essentially complete. They had found the explanation for Edward's behavior, understood Thor's role as protector. There were no more mysteries to unravel, theoretically. Caroline studied him for a long moment. "Have you ever thought about why you were chosen for this case, Mr. Miller?" The question caught him off guard. "I imagine because of my reputation with complex animal behavior cases." "Partially," she agreed. "But there's more. When we were looking for specialists, your name came up in a very specific context. A fire at an orphanage 20 years ago. A boy and his dog who saved several lives. The shock must have been visible on his face," as Caroline continued, her voice gentle. "Edward and I funded the reconstruction of that orphanage years ago. Your name was in a framed newspaper article on the director's wall. Matthew Miller, the boy who understands animals, silent hero." Memories flooded Matthew, the heat of the flames, the screams, the weight of responsibility. "I never considered myself a hero," he finally said, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "Not when so many didn't make it out. Just as Edward never considered himself a villain." Caroline replied softly, even when the evidence seemed to point otherwise. Understanding settled between them like a tacit agreement. There were deeper connections at play, too many coincidences to be just chance. "Do you believe in fate, Mr. Miller?" "I believe in patterns," he answered carefully. "In connections that aren't always evident at first glance." Caroline smiled, the first genuine smile he had witnessed since his arrival. "Edward and I have talked. We'd like you to consider a proposal." She explained how they planned to transform part of the property into a training center for assistance dogs, specializing in detecting neurological conditions like Edward's. How Thor would be the first resident, a model for the program. "And we need someone who understands both the animals and the people they will protect," she concluded. "Someone who has walked at the intersection of these two worlds." As the proposal hung in the air like a luminous possibility, Thor suddenly became alert. His ears pricked up, his body tense with focused attention. Seconds later, before any alarm sounded, the smell of smoke reached them. "Fire," Matthew whispered, a word loaded with the full weight of his past. Chaos quickly ensued. Flames erupted from the east wing of the mansion, devouring expensive curtains and antique furniture with voracious appetite. Staff ran in panic, trying to save what they could. Edward, still groggy from the new medication, was found by Robert and led to the safety of the gardens. Thor, however, had a clear mission. With Matthew by his side, he guided Caroline and Michael away from the immediate danger. But then, to everyone's horror, the dogs suddenly changed direction, running back towards the burning mansion. "Thor!" Caroline screamed, her desperation echoing in the night. Matthew knew with an instinctive certainty that transcended rational explanation what he needed to do. "Stay with Michael," he instructed firmly. "I'll get him." Before anyone could stop him, Matthew ran towards the inferno that was forming. The heat hit him like a wall, memories of another fire layering over the reality. But this time was different. This time he wasn't a scared boy, but a man with purpose. Following his instinct, he found Thor in Michael's room, persistently pulling a blanket from the crib. Understanding struck Matthew like lightning. It wasn't just any blanket. It was the blanket, the one that always wrapped Michael, that carried his scent. Something the baby would look for, something whose absence would cause discomfort and fear. "You really understand more than you should, don't you?" Matthew murmured, helping Thor grasp the blanket. Together they navigated the smoky corridors, the dog leading the way with unfailing precision. When they finally emerged from the building, coughing and covered in soot, they were met by applause of relief. Caroline, tears streaming freely down her face, hugged Thor first, then Matthew with equal intensity. "You two," she whispered, "are our guardians." The next morning, as firefighters ensured no hidden embers remained and investigators began to determine the cause of the fire, a strange calm had settled. The family and their closest staff gathered in a cottage on the property, a simpler structure, but strangely more welcoming than the imposing mansion. Edward, more lucid after a night of medically assisted sleep, approached Matthew, who was watching the sunrise with Thor by his side. "Do you know the legend of the guardian dog?" Edward asked, his voice carrying a new quality, softer, more reflective. Matthew shook his head. "It's an old story, passed down in my family, for generations, although I always considered it just a superstition," Edward continued. "It says that when a family loses its moral compass, when it strays too far from the light, a guardian will be sent to guide it back, a spirit in animal form that will remain until balance is restored." Matthew watched Thor, who seemed to listen intently, his intelligent eyes moving between the two men. "The fire was caused by a short circuit in the old electrical system," Edward revealed. "Exactly in the part of the house I had been putting off renovating, despite the technician's warnings. Another impulsive and irresponsible decision on my part. The neurological condition explains much of your behavior," Matthew offered. "It explains, but it doesn't absolve," Edward replied firmly. "Now I have to rebuild. Not just the house, but my family's trust, my reputation, my own self-confidence." He extended his hand to Thor, who allowed the affection with cautious dignity. "This dog didn't just save my son. He saved all of us, in ways we are still discovering." In the weeks that followed, a gradual transformation occurred. The Thompson family chose not to rebuild the grand mansion, preferring to adapt and expand the cottage where they had found refuge. The space became more welcoming, more true in its purpose of being a home, not just a display of status. Edward, strictly following his treatment, found a new purpose. The foundation for training assistance dogs became his priority, a way to channel his fortune into something genuinely transformative. Caroline rediscovered her passion for photography, documenting the journey of Thor and other dogs in training. Her images captured not only the beauty of the animals, but also the moments of deep connection between dogs and humans, moments of mutual healing. Michael grew healthy and happy, his first steps always under Thor's watchful eye. The German shepherd, once just a property guardian, was now celebrated as an integral family member, his extraordinary behavior inspiring studies and similar programs in other regions. And Matthew Miller, the man who had arrived with the intention of solving mystery and leaving, found himself unable to abandon what had become much more than a job. As director of the training program, he finally found a purpose that united his unique skills with his need for repair. Not just training dogs, but rebuilding lives, including his own. On a quiet afternoon, while watching Thor patiently guide a new puppy through the center's facilities, Matthew reflected on Caroline's words that night under the stars. "Do you believe in fate, Mr. Miller?" Perhaps it wasn't fate, he thought. Perhaps it was simply the mutual recognition between wounded souls, human and canine, of the capacity for healing that exists in the encounter between species. in the silent language of understanding that transcends words. Thor raised his head as if sensing Matthew's thoughts, and for a brief moment their eyes met in perfect understanding. Guardian and guided, teacher and student, savior and saved, roles that alternated between them in a continuous dance of healing. What drives a man to throw his own son to the lions? The question that started it all now had many answers. A neurological condition, a dark family history, impulsive decisions fueled by chemical imbalances. But perhaps the most important question was another. What drives a dog to appear out of nowhere at the exact moment to save not just a life, but an entire family? For this question, Matthew suspected, there would never be a completely satisfactory answer. And perhaps that was part of the beauty of the mystery. Not everything needs to be explained to be profoundly true. As the sun began to set on the horizon, bathing the training center in golden light, Matthew watched the Thompson family gathered on the lawn. Edward, thinner but with clear and present eyes. Caroline, her smile regaining the spontaneity of youth. Michael, now taking hesitant steps, laughing as he tried to reach Thor, who patiently stayed within reach without ever moving too far away. We're right, the voice of Anthony, the old employee who now oversaw the dog's care, interrupted his thoughts. It's not just humans who save animals. Matthew smiled, words unnecessary between two men who had witnessed the extraordinary becoming commonplace, the miraculous transforming into routine. In the distance, Thor raised his head like an eternal sentinel, his eyes reflecting the ancient knowledge he carried. Guardian, protector, savior, roles that transcended species, linking them all in an invisible web of shared purpose. And in that moment, under the sky that was slowly transforming from blue to golden purple, Matthew finally understood the true nature of his own journey. It wasn't about saving or being saved, about guilt or redemption. It was about recognizing that sometimes the angels who come to rescue us have 4 paws and eyes that see beyond our carefully constructed barriers. What drives a dog to save an entire family? Perhaps the same force that drives humans to open their hearts to creatures of another species. Something ancient, inexplicable, and profoundly true that, when fully embraced, has the power to transform lives, heal invisible wounds, and build bridges over the darkest abysses of the human soul.